Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Gladstone Pasternak, the very proud Executive Director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening to this very special program about a wonderful book highlighting the great story of Siggi Wilzig and his experiences during the Holocaust. And we're very, very happy to have with us this evening Ivan Wilzig, Joshua Greene, and our director of the Holocaust and Genocide Department at Florida International University, located at the Stephen J. Greene School of International and Public Affairs, Oren Stier. I just want to take a few moments to express why I'm so honored to host this exhibit, this program through the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. We are a major integrated part of the university, and we work very closely with Oren Stier and the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, as well as Dr. Brian Schreiner, the Dean of the College of Arts and Architecture. And this program is just a fabulous opportunity for us to showcase how we as the Jewish Museum of Florida are able to bring to those of you who are our followers, the wealth that comes from us being a part of Florida International University. Now, Brian Schreiner, the Dean of the FIU College of Communication, Architecture, and the Arts, was unable to join us this evening, but I'd like to share just a few words that he wanted me to share. So he wanted me to let you all know that Ivan Wilzig, the son of Siggi, who we're honoring here this evening, is a member of the FIU College of Communication, Architecture, and the Arts Dean Scholarship Advisory Board. And like his father, Ivan is an empathetic leader whose actions support his words, in that he consciously puts others first each day with this quote: "What can I do to make things better for someone?" So it is, as I said, my great pleasure to host this discussion this evening. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Oren Stier.
Thank you so much, Susan, for opening the event. And thanks again to Brian Schreiner for putting us all together and giving us this opportunity to spend the next hour or so together on Zoom in honor of and celebration of the publication of Unstoppable. I'm really excited to have both Ivan Wilzig and Joshua Greene here with us tonight. Before we get into the details, I just wanted to introduce myself and our program. I'm Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the FIU Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, which sponsors, often in conjunction with the Jewish Museum of Florida, lectures, symposia, film screenings, and other events throughout the year, including FIU's annual Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week and our annual Fishman Holocaust Studies Scholar in Residence programs. We organize annual teaching trainings, teacher trainings. We support the creation of new courses, many of them online. We consult with local, state, and national organizations concerning Holocaust and genocide education. And in the Stephen J. Greene School of International and Public Affairs, which you see behind me, we house the Holocaust and Genocide Studies certificate. It's been an interesting more than a year now with COVID and all of our Zoom events, but we really look forward, as things get back to normal, to having more events in person and developing new programs. Like I'm very anxious to try to develop a study abroad program. So in case anybody would like to check us out, please go to holocaust.fiu.edu and you can get some more information. Also, before I introduce our conversation partners tonight, I want to acknowledge that many of us are concerned about the current crisis in Israel and Gaza. Missiles are flying, sirens are blaring, and rioting and civil unrest are spreading And I simply want to say that we hope and pray that Israelis and Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, and Christians find ways soon to de-escalate the violence and pursue more peaceful means for conflict resolution. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Joshua Greene and Ivan Wilzig. Joshua Greene is a scholar of Holocaust history, a filmmaker, and an author whose biographies have sold more than 500,000 copies worldwide. Greene is a popular lecturer who's spoken at the Pentagon and before the Judge Advocate General's College, and his documentaries on Holocaust history have aired on PBS and Discovery. He's appeared on national media outlets from NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross to Fox News, CNN, and more. Ivan Wilzig, professionally known as Sir Ivan, is an international recording artist and songwriter best known for his pop dance remakes of 1960s and early 1970s peace songs. Wilsick founded the Peaceman organization, Peaceman Foundation, a nonprofit organization that battles hatred, violence, and PTSD. He's a co-owner of the Wilzig Erotic Art Museum in South Beach, Florida, and as Susan mentioned already, he serves on the Dean's Advisory Board of the FIU College of Architecture and the Arts, or CARTA. The story of his father's life, as recounted in Unstoppable, written by Joshua Greene, is one of hope and resiliency in the midst of terrifying circumstances, an inspiring story for all, regardless of gender, race, religion, etc. Indeed, Unstoppable is an engaging and ultimately a very moving book. So before we get into our conversation this evening, I'd like to introduce the subject of Joshua's biography, Siggi Wilzig, in a clip from his testimony for the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, the VHA, which was founded by Steven Spielberg. And the story itself about how Siggi came to give his testimony, over 10.5 hours worth, recorded over several months, sadly very close to the end of his life, is itself a very moving and significant story. The VHA had really stopped recording testimonies at that point in time. And in a dramatic moment in the book, Ivan went out to the Hamptons and buttonholed Steven Spielberg at a reception and didn't take no for an answer to make sure that his father's testimony would finally be recorded for posterity. FIU has a permanent lifetime subscription to the VHA, and we make all of the 54,000 plus recordings available to our students for teaching and research purposes. And so I just thought it was a rare opportunity to share a little bit of a clip so you could see Siggi himself. I should note at this point in his life, sadly, he's taking a lot of anti-cancer medication. He is not the stirring Shakespearean orator that he was earlier in his life. It's poignant to hear, but at the same time, it's remarkable. The clip that I'm just going to share is from early in the testimony where the interviewer asks him just to share a few words pre-war about his parents, what it was like growing up in the town in West Prussia, so where he grew up in Krojanke. So I'm going to share my screen and you'll get just a little bit of a taste of Siggi Wilzig.
What kind of personality did he have?
It was, the first answer I give you is that it was totally acceptable to the Gentile population. If anybody would call a dirty Jew, I don't think he was ever called a dirty Jew by anybody. And I was the last to see him in Auschwitz, in Block 9. and he was badly beaten before, and he was murdered as a result of that. And he was not kosher. And my late mother and I were strictly. We would have rather died. We lived for 2 years, we did forced labor on bread and radishes. We wouldn't eat margarine. That's why you don't find it in our house, even kosher. You can see Fleischmann's, OU, whatever you want. There'll never be margarine. And he was acceptable to the Gentile population. As I repeat, I never heard anybody insult him and call him a dirty Jew.
Can you describe your mother?
Totally different. My mother was an Orthodox woman, and God forbid she saw a child put on a button on Shabbos. It was unacceptable. Her maiden name was Sommerfeld, and the Sommerfelds were all religious, from her father down to the brothers. The Sommerfelds were the richer part of the Wilsigs. The Wilsigs were not in a poor house, but they were not to be compared. They were half country people, and as far as country people are concerned, they were considered observant. But it's very hard to be observant when you're surrounded by 99% or 98% non-Jews.
So I wanted to give you just a little bit of a taste. He goes on to tell a story there about the Sonnenfeld's brothers' shoe business in Berlin, and how the prices were so good that even these young Nazis couldn't resist going in there and buying the shoes, even though they were buying from Jews. But I'm going to pause it there, and I'd like to start out by asking Joshua, how did you come to writing this biography?
Kicking and screaming. I had written about a dozen biographies prior to this one, and I thought I was done. Really didn't want to dwell in the darkness any longer. My great privilege is having been trained at the Yale University Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust testimonies. And the scholars at Yale are very punctilious and exacting when it comes to allowing the words of the witnesses to guide the interview. The witnesses are the experts in their own experiences. And what that means is practically that for someone like myself, who's a documentary filmmaker, there's no opportunity to prejudice the editorial direction by highlighting moments of heroism or bravery. When you listen to testimony, you hear survivors talking about the unheroic things they had to do just to survive. So it's a dark subject to be producing or writing about. Then one day, about 8 years ago, the phone rings. And at the time, I didn't know that it was Ivan Siggi's son. But someone says, I've read some of your books, and I think you're the right person to tell my father's story. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm done with the darkness. I just want to go toward light now. And Ivan, like his father, a very energetic way of responding. He said, no, you don't understand. My father was the light. my father was a beacon of hope for every immigrant who ever came to America. And he continued on describing some of his father's remarkable achievements. And he convinced me to do some research, and we met, and I found that Ivan had not been exaggerating at all his father's accomplishments. And the more I learned about Siggi Wilzig, the more I thought, this is a story that deserves to be told.
Thank you. Wow, that's a great story. So Ivan, I guess my first question for you is, I want to know how you convinced Joshua, but I think what I'd like to ask, and what I think the audience would like to hear is, I think those of us who know survivors, who know children of survivors, know that it's oftentimes a unique situation. What can you share with us an anecdote or two about growing up as a child of a survivor, someone of with your father's experiences? What was that like?
Well, he was, because life became so precious to him, having seen so many people murdered on a daily basis, innocent men, women, and children, every hour on the hour for more than a 2-year period. Certain things must have traumatized him to the point where everything is a matter of life. It could be a matter of life and death. So he was a nervous, jumpy individual, and he would exaggerate something and look at it in the worst case scenario of what could happen if you do something incorrectly or foolishly or without thinking. For example, he would see 2 children fighting on a playground or something, and he'd say, "Stop!" He'd scream, "Stop it! Stop it! You're going to lose an eye." So where do you go from like children playing and wrestling to "you're going to lose an eye"? In other words, everything was intensified and exaggerated, but in reality, he had a certain, almost like a crystal ball ability, a mysterious power. And sure enough, 5 minutes after he had warned the mother, "Don't let the children horse around like that," one of the children would cut the other one's eye with a sharp object. So just like he could predict something like that, he was also able to predict when the stock market would go up or down, or the economy would go up or down. He was always like he was just overly sensitized to life and things. He himself said he credited his fox-like instincts for having survived the camps, not his strength, not his brains, but sometimes knowing how to when to volunteer for something, when not to volunteer, when to raise your hand or when to like stay in the background, when to make up this story or when to make up that story. He just had a sense he could for danger, and in that sense, that same sense of heightened senses, became an advantage later in business, because it was these were human senses that he always was sensitive to. So he could meet someone for 5 minutes. Somebody would come for a loan, dressed in a fancy suit and necktie, silk necktie and alligator shoes. And the guy would come with a financial statement and say, I own this building and this building, I own this one and this one, I own this business and that business. And 5 minutes after the guy walked out of the room, he would say, the man is full of it. These statements are worthless. He's a show-off. He wants to give the impression he's rich by the way he dresses, but he's completely leveraged. He's completely leveraged out. He has no equity in this. He's over-borrowed. He doesn't make enough money to pay back the loans. I wouldn't lend him a dime. It was like incredible how he had these sense, and it proved true. And by having that ability, he was able to make loan after loan in the hundreds, and keep the portfolio quality to make the bank very successful and grow rapidly.
Thank you. You know, it's amazing. The story is really remarkable about those instincts and such. I was, you know, when reading the biography, though, atypically, I would say, for a Holocaust memoir, and Joshua, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but the book says really very little about Siggi's life prior to deportation, aside from some anecdotes. We jump pretty quickly from 1936, when a 10-year-old Siggi moves with his family to Berlin to find better prospects. We jump from there to conscription of child labor, finding in 1943, a 16-year-old Siggi who had been making mine casings for the German war effort in a former lamp factory for 2 years or so. And all of a sudden he's arrested in the middle of the night shift, brought by a local policeman on the trolley to join his family as they're rounded up for deportation to Auschwitz. And so I was just wondering, and we're going to get to the other experiences too, but I was wondering if either or both of you could tell us something you learned from Siggi about his life before the war, something that kind of helps give a window onto his personality and his philosophies.
Well, I could say for one, and then Joshua can chime in. For example, in his early years of childhood, he demonstrated how brave he was as an individual, which he was his entire life. Brave enough to sneak into Nazi embassies and try and steal affidavits that saved members of his families after they forged them and got them out, a few of them out in time. And so that's something that he showed from a very early age to the day he died. Brave, unbelievably brave.
Yeah, I'd add a couple of things to that. One is that, you know, parenting isn't everything, but Siggi benefited from very, very loving parents. I think if you have a mother and father who care for you and love you dearly, you've got a pretty strong leg up in life. And so he had that. So from a very young age, he was encouraged to kind of be all that he could be, you might say. At the same time, he also learned early in life to think like an adult. You know, when you're a kid growing up in Jew-hating Krojanka, West Prussia, in the 1930s, early 1930s, you don't mess around. There were two kids who caught him and dangled him over a meat grinder and threatened to grind him into Jew meat, the way they called it. And after that, he didn't play with kids anymore. He would hang out with the adults, study how they think, how they made decisions, watch them playing cards, learn strategies. So he, from a very early age, you know, he was thinking like an adult, and that helped him, I think, when it came to life or death decisions.
Yeah, that's really very telling. Thinking like an adult, I'm gonna come back to that issue, but you know, before I go on, I want to remind the audience that hopefully the chat is open and you could post any questions you might want to pose to Ivan and or Joshua in the chat, and we'll be getting to them, you know, about another 15 minutes or so. So feel free to post anytime. And one thing I really wanted to bring up, one of the activities I do with my students is exploring the issue of human relationships and ethics in the context of the Holocaust, particularly prior to and in the camps. So we read memoirs by Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi, and we discuss how the Shoah impacted concepts like trust and friendship. In your book, Joshua, Siggi credits his best friend, Lothar Nartelski, Larry Nartel, who also survived, for saving his life in Auschwitz. And so I was wondering if each of you could give just maybe a little bit of perspective on Larry and Siggi's relationship with him, and And I was very struck by that, the frame story, speaking to Larry's parents. And I mean, there's really a lot there. And I think it's also important about afterwards, how Siggi treated other people. So I'm just wondering what you might have to say about that whole issue of the importance of human relationships through the camps and what they mean to people, and how that's weighed against the problems of ethics and as Joshua, as you quote Lawrence Langer, choiceless choices in the era of the camps.
Well, Larry was older by about 6 years. And, Oren, you know this better than anyone. When we attempt to examine the Holocaust period, we have to suspend the normal definitions of terms as we use them in the everyday world that we live in. A word like friendship in the upside down universe of Auschwitz was not something casual. It meant the difference between life and death. If you had someone whom you could tag team with to find scraps of food or to find a way to work indoors in the middle of a freezing winter, it could save your life. And that was the kind of relationship they had. Larry appreciated Siggi's intuitions, his abilities to come up with innovative ways to solve problems, and got him indoors, got him working in what was known by prisoners as the Canada warehouses, Canada being a country that the prisoners in Auschwitz envisioned as a very wealthy, comfortable place to be. The Canada warehouses were the depots where all of the confiscated luggage and belongings from people arriving in Auschwitz were sent for sorting out, and all the jewelry and other precious things found there were packaged up and sent to Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. After the war, they went through the camp together. They went through death marches together. They lost each other when they were separated just shy of liberation, when Siggi went to Mauthausen and Larry was sent off to a subcamp. They were reunited after the war. And my conceit in writing Unstoppable was to use a promise that Siggi had made to his friend Larry, that when Siggi would arrive in New York, he would find Larry's parents and make sure they knew that he was alive, and tell them the story of how they survived together. So the housing, the narrative housing of Unstoppable is Siggi telling Larry's parents the story of their years in Nazi Germany.
One of the things you mentioned, how Larry saved my father's life by getting him the job inside Canada, which for sure did. But then later, my father was able to return the favor, and on the death march from Auschwitz to Mauthausen, when Larry couldn't walk or carry himself, my father basically carried him on his shoulders and kept him from being shot on the spot, because when you were on that death march, anyone who lagged behind was shot. Anyone who collapsed was shot. And any excuse to shoot you, you had to keep moving and moving and moving. And if you weren't healthy enough to walk, you certainly were going to be healthy enough to do hard labor once you got there. So they got rid of you on the way. So it was a brutal, horrible thing, and my father saved his life. So with them each having saved each other's lives, you can imagine the love and the bond that they had after the war when they came to America. How often does somebody get to save your life and you get to save their life? It's a pretty rare statistic, I'm sure.
And the friendship continued afterwards as well. They were buddies in selling ties and adult garments out of the trunk of their car. They pulled their money and bought a car and traveled around selling items from the trunk of their car. And then later, after Siggi had his bank, he appointed Larry, Ivan, what was his title? Head of acquisitions or supply? Purchasing, a very, trusted position. And it's because Ivan, Siggi could trust Larry with anything. They had saved each other's lives. So it's an important story, important part of Siggi's story.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Ivan, what was that like, just kind of growing up, seeing, that relationship and other survivors? I mean, that era, you can tell from reading the book that there were certain survivors who knew each other, might play cards together sometimes. Like, what was that like as a kid in that environment?
Well, I noticed from the onset, and that made my childhood and my siblings very different from the rest of our American friends in the neighborhood, is that they had a special bond amongst themselves. You didn't have to save somebody's life in order to have this special bond. As long as you were in any way, shape, or form had been in a camp, had been on a death march, had relatives murdered, had been beaten, tortured, any of the above, because of Hitler and the Nazis and what they did, there was an immediate camaraderie and love. It was like people lost so much family that when they found anybody from any family that was still alive, it became the new family. And it gave them hope for the future, to carry on, to have children, have grandchildren, have great-grandchildren. And it would have fallen apart if they didn't stick together like that. It was a special love that nobody else could possibly imagine, of people who had been through that. I mean, you can compare it to like war buddies who were in the same platoon and went in the same battles, and forever they're pals for life because they all served and went through the same horrors. It's something like that. It's an elevated bond and friendship that's beyond normal friendship, and it probably kept them from becoming depressed, becoming loners, and even suicidal and killing themselves after the war, by feeling that they had no one left to talk to, no one left about anything, and that's why it was so special. But that was so obvious to me and my brother and my sister. So it was strange. It was different. It was scary. It was a lot of things.
The issue of these friendships and this almost like war platoon bond that you describe, it makes me think of something that I was thinking when I was reading the biography, the issue of loyalty. The issue of loyalty that Siggi almost demanded from his customers at the bank, and I think it seems to me like there was this interesting kind of trade-off, right? That he would do everything for his family. He would do everything for these people who were his close friends, people that he went through the Shoah with, and he would take good care of his customers, but he wanted loyalty in return, and I'm wondering, how did Ivan, this is a question for Ivan directly, did you get that sense of that kind of that requirement of loyalty as his son? How did you perceive this thing? I mean, the way Joshua writes about it in the book, it's almost intimidating at times,
No,
that expectation.
There's no question that loyalty meant listening to what he said. Loyalty meant obedience to what he was saying. And yes, if you didn't listen and you didn't obey, you would feel his wrath. feel his wrath. He would let you know how he felt about it, and it wasn't a good feeling. It wasn't a good feeling. It was a motivation enough to want to try and make him happy as often as we could, because he didn't want to be on the receiving end of him being of a bad mood, of a Siggi bad mood.
Joshua, when you were interviewing Siggi's colleagues and others in his orbit for the book, what is your perspective on that issue?
Well, this is first of all, this is someone who had seen human nature at its worst, and survived an environment where you couldn't trust anything that the Germans told you. You couldn't trust anything that the Nazis said. They could promise you a warm job, extra food or whatever, and the next thing you knew, they'd be sending you to the gas chamber. The values that we hold sacred were trashed inside the concentration camps. So for someone coming out of that environment, I don't think it's so surprising to find that wanting some real reassurance that if I give myself to you, if I work on your behalf, that I can count on your loyalty to me, because it was the one thing that had been betrayed again and again and again and again. So there's that aspect to it. It was difficult writing about it, quite frankly. I felt an obligation to present Siggi in, I wouldn't say an overly favorable light, but at least in a way that many extraordinary qualities were highlighted. I mean, one of the things that I found was that he embodied many of the same qualities that I would want to have in my own life, creativity and compassion, and a love of education and a sense of humor, and determination and perseverance, and things that I would want for myself and my family. But certainly he was damaged goods. I think, Ivan, was the way you once described it for me. When it came to emotional things, he had been put through the worst imaginable hells, and things were very difficult for him. He lived with nightmares, every day. I don't know that if someone has not come up in that kind of an environment with a parent who came through the Shoah, that it's possible to understand just how complex the psychology of that family dynamic can become.
I think he certainly, one way he kept the nightmares at bay was through work. Your book, recounts his really remarkable success. It's a fascinating story, and one that I was surprised to be so engaged with, because I don't read a lot of business biographies, right? And yet this was kind of a special one. I mean, not just because of where Siggi was coming from, but also because of some of those qualities that saw through, and that preternatural sense, that kind of fox-like instinct. I mean, I still don't understand how in the world he thought to just start buying up shares of Wilshire Oil, like where that even came from. Where is this, this young European Jew comes up with that, So that's, but I was struck by the issue of work, right? Work is another theme that I think runs through his life. I mean, certainly during his time in Auschwitz, as we mentioned before, I mean, the ability to work, it's an irony, we know the phrase Arbeit macht frei. It was terribly cruel irony for most who went through the camps, but yet securing indoor work opportunities, getting the opportunity to work in Canada, that's it didn't ensure survival for countless Holocaust victims, but in some cases, like Siggi's, it really made the difference. But even before that, volunteering out of the blue for special work details, saying he could do this, saying he could do that, saying he was a master. I mean, I expected to say at one point he's a master chef. It's like, and it seemed like there was nothing that he couldn't claim expertise at. Often brazenly bluffing his way in, and that really often made the difference between life and death. And then later on, he's clearly a workaholic. So I'm just wondering, on this issue of work, what's your perspective on the meaning and value of work in Siggi's experience and philosophy?
Ivan, you want to try that one?
Well, he explains in his testimony to the Show Foundation that working harder meant working longer, working faster, because if he didn't, he would be shipped. They had this fear of being shipped to the camps. So he knew that he always had to work harder than the next man with that axe hanging over his head. And so that drive, the ability to work that many hours, whether it's forced labor in an arms factory under Nazi guards, or whether it's doing forced labor in the camps, or working till 3, 4 in the morning and buying or selling a company. He had the strength. He was short, but he was strong like Hercules. He was 5'5". Men that were 6'5" couldn't keep up with him when they walked down the block. They'd be chasing him. They'd be in their dust. He just walked faster, talked faster, and thought faster than most human beings. And those skills enabled him to just keep going. I mean, I don't want to call him the Energizer Rabbit, but he was the Energizer man. He just never stopped. He never quit. He never ran out of energy. He was just a powerhouse. He was described by Barry Farber as a volcano, and that's a perfect word for him. Explosive and unstoppable, like the title of the book.
That's a great image. Joshua, do you want to add anything?
Well, when everything has been taken away from you, whatever you have, however small it may be, is priceless. So if there were even the smallest opportunity for him to find a job, something to do that would save his life, he took it. And if it meant inventing the most outrageous lies about his background, his skills, he had no problem doing that. He heard guards in Auschwitz talking about how they needed bricklayers. So he walked up and said, "I've had years of experience as a master bricklayer." I think later he said something like, "I knew about bricklaying as much as you know about belly dancing." But he would come up with these, brazen stories to stay alive. He heard that they needed a doctor's assistant in the prisoner hospital, so he volunteered for that. He says, "I couldn't even bear to see a chicken get his head cut off. And here they were having me assist in all of these horrible operations and everything." But you do what you have to do. And he did have this uncanny ability to see opportunities where others couldn't. I mean, there's this one story. Do you mind if I tell you this one story? It's one of my favorite Siggi stories. It was during the death march from Auschwitz to Mauthausen in January of 1945, freezing cold winter, and his shoes were falling off because the shoelaces had deteriorated in the snow and the sleet and the rain. And if he lost his shoes, he would get frostbite and he would die because your body's too weak after having been in Auschwitz to fight off any infection. So when the guards bedded the prisoners down for the night, he crept over to a little tree that he saw, and with a spoon, the one thing that he had kept with him from the camp was a spoon. He used the edge of the spoon to score strips of bark off of the sapling. And then he braided the pieces together and invented shoelaces from little bark of tree, and wrapped it around his feet. And sure enough, his shoes held. So that little something saved his life. And he would see the little something, that other people would overlook. When he was hunting Nazis for the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps after the war, as a way of thanking his liberators for having saved his life, he and a crew were in Linz, Austria, and they had been in someone's apartment looking for evidence that this guy might have been, in tight with the top Nazis. They didn't find anything, but it was the middle of July. It was a hot day, and Siggi saw in the fireplace of this apartment, this very beautiful apartment, marble fireplace, there was ashes. So he's saying, who makes a fire in the middle of a blazing hot day in July? So he sticks his hand into the ashes, and sure enough, he pulls out photographs of the owner of the apartment hanging out with some Nazi big shots. And he realizes that this is a potential war criminal, and was able to hunt him down. He saw those kinds of opportunities. I think it's because the smallest thing, when you have nothing, becomes priceless. And he had that kind of value for everything in his life.
He clearly had a, yeah, Ivan, go ahead.
To continue with that vision he had of seeing things where other people wouldn't notice them, that came into that was tremendously helpful in his entire success story as a businessman. Because anybody on Wall Street, anybody who's bought stock, any stockbroker, anyone who's looks at the annual reports of companies, they realize that the smart ones do anyhow, that it's not what's in the bold print, and that what meets the eyes that's important. A lot of that is just fluff to get the stockholders excited about owning the stock and how great the future of the company is. But if you're an investment analyst, you don't look at that. You're looking between the lines. You're looking at the fine print. You're not looking at the president's message, which is pretty much just an advertisement, like I told you. You're looking at the footnotes, because it's in the footnotes of those financial statements that the real worth of the company lies, and whether the company is doing well or has problems. And that was one of his, he nicknamed himself Eagle Eye, because he would not miss the smallest iota and detail. And that really was one of the great keys to his success.
I think that all of this is definitely true. It comes out very, very clearly in biography, and in if anybody has ever had a chance to watch any of his testimonies or speeches, he also credits the Almighty for his survival. And I wanted to make sure that we talk, and then I ask you about the theme of faith and the theme of Jewish identity. There's some, keeping kosher comes up again and again, and the importance of having kosher food available for his customers, right? Or that certain events would be kosher. Even though he says his mother kept kosher, his father not as much, or Sabbath observance. There are these practical aspects to Jewish identity, but then there's also this aspect that comes up again and again of faith, of the importance of Jewish identity. What is your perspective, each of you, on the role that Judaism and Jewish faith and identity played for him in his survival and after?
Well, he certainly over and over again credits the Almighty for having saved his life, given him an opportunity, given him the intelligence to think of the opportunity. But he definitely felt inspired and looked over by a higher, more powerful being than that which exists on earth. And that spiritual bond he had with whoever is, he's looking at above, was seemed to have strengthened his immune system, which has been a proven thing in scientific studies, that whether there is a God or there isn't a God, it remains to be seen. But when you believe in one, it's been proven that it can strengthen your immune system. So in my father's case, he credits his belief in the Almighty for saving his life. And while other people might call it luck, he might call it luck one day himself. But in the same breath, he would also say it was the Almighty that was made him lucky. He would still tie the two together.
There was a qualification, though. Several times in the transcripts of his talks, or in the stories that Siggi's children or friends shared with me researching the text of this book, it was clear that he was very troubled by the children who were killed in the Holocaust. The 1.5 million young people under the age of 12, I believe, is the statistic, who died in the Holocaust, who were murdered. And that troubled him deeply. His closest friend, when it came to these profound issues, and Oren, you and I share, I think, the experience of teaching theodicy on an undergraduate level. How do you reconcile a God-centered view of creation with evil and the horrors that happened 85 years ago in Europe? He would go to his rabbi, and that was the one place, I think, where he became a real philosopher. He was always wise. He had insights into things. But I think when he was with his rabbi is when he went deep into theological issues. And well, I think one thing he would say if you were here is that don't think that the story of the Holocaust, the importance of understanding the Holocaust, doesn't apply to you if you happen to not be Jewish. If you happen to be, agnostic or atheist or Catholic or Muslim, whatever you may be, this story concerns you as well, because the target now is the Jews. Tomorrow it will be some other group. And I'm jumping around a little bit, but Oren, you may recall the footage from January 6th with the man among the people storming the Capitol building who's wearing that sweatshirt with Camp Auschwitz printed on the sweatshirt. That kind of racism and anti-Semitism are still alive. They're at the heart of the violence and the bitterness and the hatred that we've seen around us for too long now. I think Siggi would have wanted people to understand the history of the Holocaust, regardless of whether they were believers or not, because he understood that this history is critical to our survival moving forward.
I think, that you already gave an answer to the next question I was going to ask, which I wanted to ask what you think Siggi's perspective would be on the resurgence of anti-Semitism today, just increasing racial tensions and everything that seems like the world is going through this upheaval right now. I'm wondering, Joshua, I think you already gave an answer to it. You could certainly add to it, but I'm wondering, Ivan, what do you think your father would say to seeing a resurgence of anti-Semitism in particular 2021.
Well, it wouldn't surprise him because from the day I was able to understand the meaning of the word, he always thought that anti-Semitism always was and always will be. He was a man of extremes. He thought there will always be wars, and there'll be peace. There'll always be anti-Semitism, maybe less anti-Semitism at other times, but it's not going away. There will always be rich people and there will always be poor people. So for somebody who sees the world in black and white, it would not come as a shock that there will always be anti-Semitism. And I think a lot of that came from, at least at that time, he had reason to believe, because if the church in catechisms in schools were teaching the world and putting on passion plays that the Jews killed Christ, that the Jews murdered the Son of God, if that story wasn't going to change radically, which it hadn't in his lifetime, it only changed in the 70s when the Pope said it was the Romans, not the Jews. But when you have for centuries and centuries and centuries, that being instilled into the generation after generation after generation of Christians, you instill that brainwashing and that evil notion that these are the enemies of our religion, and anything that comes to them, they deserve. They should be exterminated or killed or tortured or whatever. It's a sad thing, but it all boils down to education. Fortunately, things have evolved in that regard, and Jews and Christians get along like brothers, like one family, which nobody would ever think could occur. Now there's bigger problems with Muslims, but Jews and Christians, they sort of like almost proved my father wrong. They're doing the best to eliminate anti-Semitism and get along well.
There are definitely pockets of, optimism out there, and your father was certainly a great optimist. I think that comes through very clearly. I want to, there's a question that came through the Facebook Live feed, so I thought I should respect that. It reads, in your video interview with Speak Show Arts, and which is, by the way, I was just going to plug it, so I'll put that in the chat also, the link for Speak Show, which is FIU's arts magazine, edited by Ray Ellman. But in your video interview, you said that near the end of his life, Siggi said to the Shoah Foundation that he didn't think he could live without his daily nightmares. Could you please elaborate?
Well, his words were that the nightmares give him a hyper-realistic sense of what it means to be alive, the difference between life and death, particularly as a Jew, and that God forbid if he ever had to go through it again, he would go through it again as a Jew. When Siggi said he had nightmares, that's not nightmares like you and I have. These were the worst possible kinds of nightmares. At one time he described seeing his own children walking into the flames of the crematorium oven. I don't think, one of the challenges that we have teaching Holocaust is a tendency on the part of people who don't know better to think that there's a way we can spew out some kind of happy ever after ending here. We'll find some kind of message, redemptive message at the heart of the Holocaust that'll make it all worthwhile. Because if we can't find a takeaway of some kind, then what was the point in going through it? Well, there is no happy ever after to the Holocaust. And Hollywood doesn't help, of course. They come out with film after film that attempts to prove otherwise, that it's entertaining. And one of the hard lessons, and one of the critically important lessons, is to recognize that it is in the details of the depth and scale of what occurred that we come to understand the nature of the Holocaust. And Siggi was absolutely uncompromising about that. One of the things that impressed me so deeply, hearing his testimony and reading the transcript of his speeches and watching video recordings, he had no problem whatsoever letting people know, like square between the eyes, this is what happened. There was one lecture he gave at Livingston Synagogue in New Jersey. He said, even if you hear me tell you this 1,000 times, I don't think that you can believe it. And then he would tell them, this is what happened to me. That's what happened to me. This is what I saw. That's what they did to children. He was uncompromising because he wanted to drive home this very essential point. There is some dark abyss of human nature that was revealed, exposed during the Holocaust period. And if we don't continue our efforts at understanding what that was, what happened, if we don't study the history of the Holocaust, we leave ourselves vulnerable to that darkness emerging again. And we're seeing it. Oren, you opened this program this evening with a report on what's happening in Israel today. This is front page news. This isn't new. And it's not going to go away. And Siggi's point was, don't flinch. Don't go away from the harshness of what happened, because that's what's going to help you understand how important this is. Ivan, I don't know whether it was you who had the idea, but in Siggi's office at his bank in New Jersey, there was a marble plaque over the mantelpiece with his slogan, his life's motto, free men who forget their bitter past do not deserve a brighter future. So he didn't let the darkness of his past dominate him. It didn't define who he was, but he never forgot it, and he never wanted anyone else to forget it either.
That's almost as good as a closing statement as I could have imagined. I think I would like to ask Ivan if you could also, we're past 8 o'clock, and so we should probably wrap things up, but you know, if you could also impart one thing you learned from your father's life, your father's experience, the one thing that you think is, you know, as Joshua, I think so clearly put it, you know, what is the important message you think that Siggi left behind for you in particular?
Well, he used to say, he once said to my brother, when my brother was complaining, they was picking on him too much when he was trying to move up the ranks to the bank. And he said to my father, why do you bust my chops every day? You're driving me crazy. And he answered, everything in life can be fixed except death. So don't worry, you'll figure it out, you'll survive, life will go on, and you can accomplish great things. But if you're dead, it's all over. So just worry about staying alive, and that's the most important thing. And then the rest, whatever you become, will be better than dead.
Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time tonight. You know, the flyer for tonight's event read in part, Siggi embodied resilience, determination, and unshakable faith. As we step tentatively towards the post-pandemic world, the flyer asked, what can we learn from Siggi's life and from the lives of his fellow Shoah survivors? What secrets for spiritual success can they impart to us? I want to thank you both for providing some answers to those questions tonight in the last hour, and for so graciously and generously agreeing to appear as part of this program. Of course, the book Unstoppable is available, highly recommended, available wherever you acquire your books. And it's wonderful, Joshua, seeing you again. Ivan, it's wonderful meeting you. And I hope that we can get together for future occasions in person one day. Come down to FIU, come down to the Jewish Museum of Florida. I want to thank the museum again, as well as Dean Schreiner and Carta for helping us set this up. And most of all, I want to thank Joshua Greene and Ivan Wilzig and everyone for coming tonight to honor the story and the memory and the survival of Siggi Wilzig. May his memory be for a blessing. Thank you all and good night.
And let me thank you, Oren, for facilitating such an interesting and insightful conversation from the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. We're very happy you all joined us this evening. Thank you, Joshua Greene and Ivan Wilzig and Oren Stier for a wonderful program. Good night.
Good night, all.